I think we're going to make a start. All right, hello everybody, and welcome to the fifth in our Build Back Better How series. Today we'll be talking about deliberating and doing how. So I'm Frances Foley, I'm the Deputy Director at Compass, and I'm host for this lunchtime session. So whether you're taking a break from work, whether I'm on half term, or whether you're just logging on to get your dose of optimism in your lunch break, we're really glad that you're here, and thanks very much for joining us. The session today will be an hour and 15 minutes. I'll run through the format really briefly in a second, but we aim to finish dead on 1:45 to allow you all to go and take your final lunch or go for your walk around the park like I will be doing. So far in our series, we've covered some pretty big ideas. We looked at globalization and the changes and the challenges to globalization in the 21st century. On Tuesday, we ran through the big ideas around Build Back Better, especially focusing on economic changes, universal basic services, and universal basic income. On Wednesday, we looked at ideas for rapid transition and questions about how our landscapes and our cities are changing to accommodate active travel and how we might remove corporate advertising from our public spaces. And yesterday we looked at connecting the community and how we can build on the amazing surges of solidarity and ingenuity we've seen over the crisis. So today we're talking about a subject which is really close to my heart, and it's about democracy. We'll be hearing from three amazing speakers who are really massive experts in their fields, both in terms of the doing and also the conceptualizing and I would say publicizing, communicating democracy to a wider audience. So we'll be talking a little bit about both the process of the how of democracy and the deliberation, and also the why we need to do it, and ways in which it can be integrated into our current processes and ways of doing things. So when we look at and think about Build Back Better and think about the challenges that are ahead of us, whether it's climate or social care or Brexit or social polarization, we're really thinking about power and new ways of making decisions for the big challenges we face. And what I find passionately interesting and exciting about this topic, it's a sort of meta blend of both the actual practical, how we go about making those decisions collectively and learn that capacity and learn to build our democratic muscle, but also why we're doing it in a democratic spirit and why democracy is important and what it looks and feels like. So we've been undergoing a period of democratic turbulence, I would say, and challenges to our representative systems. And all three of our speakers today will touch on why that's relevant and why it matters, and also what we can do about that in terms of energizing and igniting more people to take action and to participate in our democratic processes. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our three speakers. The way this is going to run is that they're going to give their little pitch for about 8 minutes each. We'll hear a very specific example about how we might be building back better in a democratic way. And then after the pitches, we'll all go into breakout rooms. You'll have already received a survey asking you which breakout room you'd be interested in joining. And we'll be in those breakout rooms for about 25 minutes. If you change your mind or you didn't participate in the survey, that's fine. I'll explain when we go into the breakout sessions how you can flip between rooms. You can stay in our main session and we'll reallocate you. And then we'll come back together at the end to just hear what action we might take on the things that we've heard. And as I say, finish at 1:45 sharp. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our three speakers. The first is Stuart White. He's Sheffield based, as he wanted me to say. But he's also professor at the Department of Politics and International Relations at Oxford. We have Sarah Allen, who's head of engagement from the public participation charity Involve. And we have Amy McDonnell from the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill, which I always struggle to say. And she'll be talking about ways in which you can support that bill as well in the process. So those speakers are going to speak in that order. And then after that, we'll have a chance to choose our breakout sessions if you have changed your mind. So without further ado, I'm moving over to Stuart. Over to you, Stuart.
Thank you, Francis, and hello to everybody. Thanks to Grace, Francis and Compass for organising this discussion. I'm just going to try and share my screen. Oops. Okay, so hopefully now you can see the presentation. Great. So what I want to talk about is the possible role of citizens' assemblies in the way that we do democratic reform. So a lot of people in the political space in and around Compass support democratic reform. And we can see this as part of what we mean by building back better. So, for example, many people support reforming the electoral system to the Commons, to proportional representation, PR, and there are other commitments around reforming the House of Lords and devolution and so on. But I think it's important to ask the question, how as progressives should we do democratic reform? And some people might say, well, what do you mean by that question? I mean, isn't it sort of straightforward how we do reform? So if we take something like PR, then one view says, well, all we need to do, if we can, is get a progressive government elected, maybe some coalition of Labour and Lib Dems and Greens, and then the government will just legislate for proportional representation through Parliament as it would for anything else. So the way we do reform is just to get a government elected, and then that government does what governments do, legislation through Parliament. But I think there's possibly something wrong with that straightforward view of how we do democratic reform. I've no doubt that doing it that way is, in terms of our present constitution, legitimate, because our present constitution is based on parliamentary sovereignty. But I'm still not sure that either morally or politically that's the right way to go about changing something like the electoral system. And I think a problem with that view, that we just legislate PR in through Parliament, is that it seems to me to break with an important principle that progressives ought to respect and promote. The principle which says that politicians, including elected politicians, shouldn't get to choose by themselves what the basic rules of the political system are.
Sorry to interrupt, Stuart. Do you want to start the presentation mode so it's full screen and people can see the slides a bit easier?
Oh, sorry, I thought I was full.
That's okay. If you press slideshow, you should be able to press present or start.
Sorry.
Up at the top the top left-hand corner, after animations, it says slideshow.
Yeah.
I think you can just press I can't actually see your full screen.
Play from current slide, I think.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Awesome.
Got it. Okay.
Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you for that. So this principle that says politicians, including elected politicians, should not get to choose by themselves what the basic rules of the political system are. Why do I think that's an important principle? Well, I think, first of all, there's a conflict of interest consideration, that if elected politicians have the power to change the rules by themselves, then they will use that power over time to their own and their supporters' advantage, which won't necessarily reflect the national interest. And we might say, well, okay, we can see how, the opposition, how the Tories might misuse this power, but we're the good guys, surely it's okay for us to do this. But I think then we come to an important principle of democratic ethics, which is that if you think that a restriction should apply to the other side in politics, you generally have to accept the same restriction for yourself. So if we think there's something imprudent or unfair about the other side just being able to legislate changes to the political system through Parliament because of the conflict of interest reason, then I think we have to accept the same restriction for ourselves. Now, interestingly, I think the UK in recent decades actually has developed a convention which restricts in practice the power of politicians to change the political system by themselves. And that convention is that we hold referendums through which people give consent to major changes to the political system, to its status or its structure. Of course, we've had referendums on EU membership, on devolution, AV, Scottish independence. But referendums, perhaps as a result of the 2016 Brexit referendum, referendums in general now, I think, are, or at least in some quarters, people have very considerable anxieties about referendums, and perhaps that emerging referendum convention has now been unsettled. So I think a possible complement or alternative to the referendum in this context is the Citizens' Assembly. Citizens' Assembly is, as I put it on the appendix, it's an assembly tasked with addressing a question like what electoral system should the UK use. The representatives in the assembly are selected on a near random basis from the general public so as to be representative of the population in terms of things like gender, race and region. And the assembly works through its question in 3 stages: a learning phase, an evidence gathering and testimony phase, and then a final phase in which it deliberates and makes a recommendation, with discussion professionally facilitated at all stages. So my suggestion is that instead of a progressive government just legislating PR, a progressive government should set up a citizens' assembly to consider what electoral system should be used to elect the Commons. It should set that up the question should be open-ended. It shouldn't sort of point and predetermine the answer. And the government would then legislate for PR if the Citizen Assembly recommends this. So I think this would be a way to put the people directly in the process of political reform so that it's not wholly in the hands of elected politicians. We have a number of examples from around the world of the Citizen Assembly being used to explore precisely this question, and doing so in a very successful way, at least in terms of developing a clear and well thought out proposal. So there's a case from British Columbia in 2003-04 where a citizen assembly considered a possible reform to the electoral system to the provincial parliament and recommended a reform towards a form of PR. There's a similar example from Ontario in 2006. Again, the Citizen Assembly recommended a form of PR, though interestingly a different form of PR to the one that the British Columbia Assembly recommended. And there's another similar example from the Netherlands in 2006 of a Citizen Assembly which recommended a reform to the existing system of PR then in place in the Netherlands. So we know that this can be done. So to sum up then, I just want to focus on the pluses and minuses of trying to do democratic reforms such as a shift to PR through this Citizen Assembly's approach. The big minus, of course, is that if the Citizen Assembly is genuinely independent, as it has to be, it's not worth doing if it isn't a genuinely independent entity, then there's obviously a risk that it won't recommend PR. It might recommend that we stick with first past the post or adopt some other non-proportional system. So there's a risk there if we're really committed to this outcome of getting PR. But there are also some clear pluses, I think, to this proposal. Firstly, it, I think, respects and promotes that principle that I set out earlier, the principle that elected politicians should not by themselves get to choose the rules of the political system. And I think establishing that principle is itself an independently desirable democratic reform. I don't think we should think of democratic reform just in terms of outcomes like PR, a reformed second chamber and so on. I think we need to think of democratic reform as changing the way we do reform to the political system and establishing this principle that elected politicians don't get to remake the rules themselves is itself an important principle, an important outcome in democratic reform. Secondly, if we did it this way, then if we did get a recommendation of PR and legislation to enact PR, I think PR would have more legitimacy because it had been achieved through this citizen assembly route. And thirdly, a more kind of Machiavellian consideration perhaps is that if we focus on the process of thinking about reform to the electoral system in the form of citizens' assemblies, then that might offer a way to handle internal disagreements amongst progressives about electoral reform. So there's disagreement, perhaps especially within Labour, about whether PR itself is desirable, and there are disagreements within and across parties about what form of PR is desirable. Rather than having to thrash through all of that within and across parties, we can perhaps have a less divisive policy of agreeing that we should all support a citizen assembly to examine electoral reform, and then we can all fight our own corner when the citizen assembly meets. So I've got, if you want me to send you the slides, I can do that. There are some references and suggestions for further reading there, but I'll stop there for now.
That's brilliant, so rich. Thank you, Stuart. I've got one question, which a couple of people asked in various different ways in the chat, and I think is really important for the questions that you've raised. And that is about this idea of political will or political commitment backing the Citizens' Assembly, especially with the relations in relation to democratic reform. And that's this question of, okay, a Citizens' Assembly can be small, but high in quality. That's the idea of it, democracy under good conditions, sometimes we call it. And a referendum is mass and allows everybody to participate, but the quality can't always be assured in terms of the debate. It can be very agonistic. There can be lots of division, people throwing their ideas around, but that's also part of democracy. How do we navigate that sort of difficult territory where we're saying, okay, we want everybody to have their view on something which is constitutionally important for this country, like a change to the voting system, but also we want that quality of debate and the assurances of good facilitation and dialogue that we can get in a citizen assembly. Can we have a citizen assembly on democratic reform where we also didn't have a referendum?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. So I think ideally we should have both. So, I would like to see I think in principle, the right way to do democratic reform is through a citizens' assembly followed by a referendum. But there's a big challenge there in terms of how we do referendums. Do we know how to do referendums well? And the 2016 experience has raised all kinds of questions about that. And there's a question about how the citizen assembly debate carries over into the wider public sphere in order to inform a referendum. And I think we need to, there's more kind of thinking and research to be done on that. So in a way, the argument I'm making here is a much less ambitious one. It's just that even if you don't want to go down the route of a referendum because of the trauma of the Brexit referendum, and you're skeptical that we know how to do a referendum at the UK level in a genuinely deliberative way, then it doesn't follow from that it's okay to just legislate for PR through Parliament. This binary of referendum or Parliament is not one that we have to face. We can still respect this idea that elected politicians themselves should not have complete control over political reform by putting the Citizens' Assembly into the process. So ideally, I'd like to see both, but if people are skeptical about referendums, then I still think there's a strong case for putting the Citizen Assembly in there as a complement to parliamentary decision making.
So kind of an injection of democracy and public participation, but not necessarily at the mass level. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, well, in a perfect segue, I would say, onto Sarah about this, because also, so Sarah Allen involved has also been deeply involved in the climate assembly that we've had over the past year. I'm not entirely sure, 18 months. It's been quite a long process. And I think what's interesting, I'm sure you'll go into this in your presentation, but this question of the Climate Assembly, you've got an amazing report, which I'll definitely ask, and hopefully Grace can link this in the chat, that's come out of the Climate Assembly. This question of implementation and some of the big changes and lifestyle changes to the way that the UK functions, how that will actually work and how that will get broader democratic buy-in and uptake, I think is a question that now is very apposite, given that the Climate Assembly has come to its conclusion and put forward these recommendations. But over to you, Sarah.
Great. So thank you very much. I've also got a presentation that I'm going to share, so I'm going to try and share my screen now. Can everybody see that okay? Can people nod at me? That's great. So I'm really pleased to be here today to pitch my idea. And the idea that I want to pitch is that to build back better, we need to build back with. So we need to build back with people, communities and stakeholders, and that we need to do that at every level of government. So the good news is, if you like this idea, that it's already happening in some areas and on some issues. So I'm going to give you one local and one national example. So the local example that I'm going to talk about is Bristol City Council's work on COVID recovery. So for them, building back with had at least three aims. So first of all, they talked about building back better. So they talked about a more resilient, more fair and a more sustainable city. Secondly, they said that they wanted to understand better the impact of COVID-19 on residents and what to do about it. And thirdly, in doing that, said they wanted to confront and address inequalities, so social, racial, economic inequalities that they felt had existed in Bristol pre-pandemic, but that they had also become further entrenched due to the pandemic. So how did they do that? So they chose a multi-stage process. They started with focus groups that aimed to hear from the broad range of people in Bristol about how COVID-19 and lockdown had affected them. And they used the outcomes and what people said in those focus groups to shape a survey. So topics coming out of them included things about working from home, travel, incomes, job opportunities, and much more. So they then launched a survey at the beginning of August. So this is quite a recent example. And one of the interesting things that they did was to track responses from different communities in Bristol, which meant they could then target different groups to ensure that they'd heard from the full diversity of the city. And they're now looking through the recommendations from that survey and looking to pick out issues that are both important, but also which divide local opinion. And on those ones where there are local divisions on the issues, they're looking to take those to a citizens' assemblies, either later this year or early next year, I believe. So one of the things that's really good practice about this, which touches on the conversation that we were just having, is that they were very clear from the start how the outcomes of these processes were going to feed into decision making. So it's going to feed in two ways. So first of all, it's going to inform Bristol's recovery plan. And secondly, it's going to inform the annual refresh of what they call their One City plan, which is about their vision to 2050. So that's one local example. I could have picked lots of others. So there's the work of, for example, of Camden, Leeds and Kendal on climate change, or on Waltham Forest on hate crime. But I'm going to move on to my national example, given the amount of time or lack of time that we have. So this picture then was taken at Climate Assembly UK. And as Francis said, I need to declare an interest because led the delivery of this particular Citizens' Assembly. So what is Climate Assembly UK? So it was the first ever UK-wide Citizens' Assembly on climate change. It was commissioned by 6 select committees of the House of Commons, and they asked it to look at a really specific question. So how should the UK reach its target of net zero emissions by 2050? They commissioned the Assembly off the back of the UK setting its net zero target in June 2019. So at that point, government and parliament agreed what the target should be, but they didn't agree how the UK was going to get there. And the committees wanted to understand public preferences about that because of the impact those decisions are going to have on people's lives in particular, and then to use that in their scrutiny work when they're looking at how government is progressing and what they're doing to reach net zero. So that was the aim. In terms of how the process worked, it brought together 108 people from all walks of life and all across the UK. They met across 6 weekends, so 3 face-to-face in Birmingham and then 3 online, courtesy of COVID-19. And they went through the 3 stages that Stuart outlined. We tend to break them up slightly differently, but they're the same thing. So first of all, they learned about the issue, heard a lot of different perspectives on how the UK should get to net zero. Then they discussed what they'd heard and also brought into that their own life experiences, their own preferences, their own needs, their own values. And then they made their recommendations. They had a decision-making phase at the end. So as Francis said, you can see the decisions and the rationale for them in the Assembly's report, which was published on the 10th of September. It sets out the Assembly's view on everything from the principles that should underpin the path to net zero to what the future should look like and how we should get there across a wide range of areas, including how we travel, what we eat, how we heat our homes, where our electricity comes from. It also says, relevant to today's discussion, that how we recover from COVID-19 should help to achieve net zero. And it talked about the need for local engagement as well as national engagement, and the fact that wherever possible, local areas should be able to pick the solutions best suited to them. So what's happened since the report has been published? So in terms of the Select Committee's response, I think the most important development is that the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Committee has launched a standing inquiry to regularly review government progress in implementing the Assembly's recommendations. The Committee on Climate Change, moving away from the committees for a second, is using the Assembly's recommendations to inform its 6th carbon budget, which they're publishing on the 9th of December. And the government has said that it's going to consider the Assembly's findings closely as it shapes its approach to net zero. In addition to that, we've been busy since the launch of the report. We've now briefed over 800 civil servants and stakeholders on the Assembly's results in kind of a series of detailed thematic briefings. So that's a national example. So if those are 2 examples then about how building back with could be done, great, but why should we care? Why is building back with important? So I'm going to go through 4 reasons, and there are many others. So first of all, why it's important is that we get better decisions and policies when they're built from a wide range of knowledge, experience and ideas. So our understanding and our imaginations, they're limited by our own social experiences. That's true of me, it's true of politicians, civil servants, scientists and so on. And when you're hearing the voices of those who are rarely listened to, that might be those who are least listened to, that's what I'm trying to say, the people who are least listened to, or indeed people directly affected by decisions, or the general population, that can radically change accepted opinions about what needs to be done and how best to do it. Secondly, building back with can help unblock progress. So decisions can get politically stuck, and perhaps that's because politicians are worried about the fact that they're not vote winners, for example, or maybe a local community is really divided about what should happen. So what I'd call deliberative engagement, so techniques that bring different people together to learn from each other, to potentially hear from specialists, to discuss the issues and then make recommendations, can really help unstick those issues by giving decision makers the confidence and the legitimacy to move forward in those areas. Thirdly, deliberative techniques are great for building understanding. So they take people outside of their social bubbles to discuss issues with people who they'd never normally meet and whose perspectives and experiences they'd never normally hear. So they build understanding between different groups of people, between individuals. Where the process also involves hearing from specialists, they also build understanding of the reality of the decisions and trade-offs facing decision makers, which is important as well. And with those 2 types of increased understanding and a sense that decisions were also arrived at fairly, you get the build of trust and the buy-in to decisions that are sometimes needed to take and should be needed to take decision making forwards. And lastly, my last point, why is it important? It's important because we live in a democracy. And if we want that democracy to stay healthy in a 21st century world, we need to do much better than a vote once every 5 years, plus consultations that only allow people to express opinions on predetermined options. So my case then is that to build back better, we need to build back with, and that building back with and the sorts of examples that I've talked about need to be the norm, not the exception.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sarah. As people have heard me say before on these Zoom calls, I always find it strange that we can't give a round of applause or suggest appreciation, but I know there's a lot of people engaging with that in the chat, and I'm sure you'll get also a lot of questions in the breakout room. I have one question for you to abuse my host privilege, and that is just this question about what happens to the citizens who are involved in these processes. So similar to you, I was working on a project last year around the Citizens Convention on democracy issues. And we were thinking about how could these citizens also act as stewards for this process after the recommendations have been handed in? Because we've also had a lot of comments in the chat about this idea of political will, hence my first question to Stuart. And how do we hold, given that we still live in a representative structure, still given that these recommendations will be put forward and injected into this representative process, how do citizens and that kind of participatory, deliberative process, how do those citizens still continue to engage with that once it gets handed over to the politicians? So, in the case of Ireland and the changes to the constitution we saw through many different citizen assemblies there, in a couple of cases, in changes to equal marriage and for abortion rights, we had a referendum. But obviously here, we don't have any sort of referendum process. And so the question is, how do both those citizens who are involved specifically in the Climate Assembly and also wider citizens, like broadly, more generally, citizenship, get involved in this process and implementing these changes?
Well, that's a huge question with a lot of different parts, I think. So one part of the answer is, I think, about combining different ways of engaging with people. So when you look at some of the processes that have happened locally, so for example, the Climate Assembly in Camden, you had a whole process of crowdsourcing ideas from the community and a lot of work that went into that. And then those ideas fed into the Citizens Assembly. So you've got much wider engagement than going into the process. Following on from that, I know Camden's also, I think I'm right in saying this, I may have my processes mixed up, but they're continuing to involve citizens in residents, don't like the word citizens, residents in how they're looking to progress things in Camden, and then reaching out again to involve people in the kind of detail of how work is taken forward in each of those areas. So I think any method of engagement, it's never in and of itself enough. It's always part of a wider process and an ongoing process of engagement. And I think part of the answer to your question is thinking about it like that.
Yeah, and that's a really good example, actually, because I was a facilitator in Camden, as it happens, and there's so many people on the day said, how do I stay? I was a facilitator for the final session. They said, how do I stay involved? I really want to continue. This has been a really interesting experience for me. And part of the reason I'm such a fan of citizen assemblies is because of the experiential element of it. For a lot of people, being part of that process changes the way that they act and the way that they think about politics and the way that they think about their own agency and their role in making decisions. So it was really amazing to see so many people come forward and say, I want to continue to be involved in this. And good that Camden and that have been factored into the process going forward. Brilliant. So next, finally, in terms of our speakers lineup, we have Amy McDonald. So you're going to tell us a bit about the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill. Now, it's interesting to see how these two issues also intersect. We've had the Climate Assembly on one hand, and of course, we've got this bill, which is engaging very much with the representative process. But of course, I know that you're an expert and an advocate for participatory and deliberative processes as well. So over to you, Amy.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Francis, and really great to hear those presentations as well. I agree, it's really nice as this sort of set in a series. I'm just going to share my screen and play. Yeah, so I am here to talk about the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill campaign. So this is a bill that was put forward, presented by Caroline Lucas on the 2nd of September, with a full complementary group of co-sponsoring MPs representing every political party apart from the Conservatives working on them. And so I want to talk a bit about the contents of the bill, which obviously integrates deliberative processes as well. But my proposal for Building Back Better is that all of us really need to understand, and we need to be able to get to grips with the climate and ecological emergency. And to know, it's really important to know what we're facing in order to be able to act accordingly. And I think, as we've been hearing, that's what deliberative processes are really, really good at. So in order to do this, we need mass citizen action to both demand and create an emergency strategy to face the climate and ecological emergency. So I know we've heard a bit about the Climate Assembly UK, and I'm arguing in this presentation that it's not a kind of either or, but that it's really important, and I'll speak about this with my final slide actually, to always have citizen processes along with making these kind of big and bold decisions about ways forward. So what the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill campaign is all about is really sort of snowballing and getting a wide range of citizen action to demand this emergency strategy. So we're working with a real proper grassroots campaign, and this sort of campaign strategy is based on the Big Ask, which actually led to the Climate Change Act in 2008. So although most legislation sort of comes directly from government, these processes are run by people like People for Power, who also run these campaigns with big grassroots action to be able to push MPs and gradually push towards new legislation. So it'll be snowballing with community alliances, with local governments, with different businesses and community groups. So I'm going to really quickly go through this. These bullet points are actually on our current website, but just to give you a really quick breakdown of what the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill contains, it's basically getting the government, rather than focusing on the 2050 net zero target date, which is much too late, it would just give us a 50-50 chance of not going over 1.5 in global heating. We're saying that we need to stick to the most stringent end of the Paris Agreement, which is to be able to remain at 1.5 and to do so in a fair way. So to recognise that some countries need to act further and faster than others. Also, the bill talks a lot about not offshoring our responsibilities. So at the moment, we only take into account emissions that take place on UK soil, but we know much of our products are manufactured overseas. And so we need to understand that the UK emissions also include the manufacture, the transportation of goods as well, which would actually increase our emissions by, I think, 46%. So almost it's doubling the amount of work that we need to do. And in the bill, ecological concerns really sit side by side with climate issues. So we also have to recognise the damage that's created all along supply chains, again, from manufacture, transportation, waste. And the bill calls on government to actually conserve biodiverse habitats all the way along those supply chains. And then, of course, there's a citizens' assembly. And there's a model for the citizens' assembly where it's working directly with government and parliament in order to create this emergency strategy. This is a bit convoluted, but this is my my chart for how the citizens' assembly works. And I can go over it more in the breakout session. But basically, it's saying that anything that's 2/3 recommended by the citizens' assembly gets put forward in a draft strategy. Any recommendations with 80% that aren't tax raising would go straight to a motion of approval by Parliament. Any that are tax raising, and this is sort of a quirk of it being a private member's bill, would have to go through government, but it would have to consider and try and reach agreement with the Citizens' Assembly. So this is kind of a little stick in the sand, a little nudge for the potential of there being more ongoing interaction between government or Secretary of State and the Citizens' Assembly. And any, the 2/3 and up can be considered, and then it all passes through Parliament. So basically, it's setting a new precedent and a new sort of mechanism for citizens' involvement and their interaction with the parliamentary system. So why do we need deliberative democracy to tackle the climate and ecological emergency? Like I said at the beginning, I think actually it's really critical that people understand the full extent of the issue and the changes that are required, because obviously the action we need involves big lifestyle changes, as Sarah was saying, whether that's to do with sort of heating, what we eat, how we travel. And really the question is, how do we want to live, and how do we want to live together in the future? And I think people often paint this in quite a bleak way when it comes to climate and ecological emergency. But actually, this is happening to us anyway. We have no choice but to act, because it will get worse and worse. So obviously, if we're leaders in this, we can think of inventive and great ways to live really healthy lifestyles in the future. Also, politicians need our help. This has come up in reports by Rebecca Willis, that many of you might know, who's involved in CAUK and lots of other deliberative processes. But she's written research on the fact that politicians, even if they personally would like to act, don't want to appear like a zealot. They don't want to just stick their neck out, seem a bit crazy perhaps. They're also worried about how their constituents will respond. They need to keep their jobs. So this as well is the reason for us to mass campaign, mass citizens involvement. And obviously the last one is that we really need to hold those in power to account. So us as citizens need to understand the processes that are taking place. At the moment, the government aren't keeping up with their targets that are set by the CCC. They're really behind, and everyone needs to know about this, and everyone needs to know. So I think if citizens are involved from the outset, there's an interest in the process, an interest in what's happening, and it sort of holds government in a really different way. This is a final slide that I'll talk about at the end.
Brilliant. That's great. Thank you, Amy. I have really one tiny quick question before we go into the breakout rooms. And that is this question about, so we like to think also that citizens, and I do believe this, that citizens given the right information and time and understanding of the issues and reflection will come to some really fantastic conclusions and be able to negotiate and navigate these difficult trade-offs that we're going to have to think about in terms of climate and ecological emergency. But do you also think that as part of this process that we'll also have to hear from some citizen groups who may be advocating against certain trade-offs, or where the trade-offs are, especially huge, or the burdens are extremely huge? For example, people from the agricultural sector or from the oil industry. Is there sort of room within this process to create space for those people to give testimonials and to really put their case to the Citizen Assembly, such that that can be really brought up and integrated into the trade-offs and to the kind of the results, the recommendations that come out?
Yes, and I think the framing is so important with this, and obviously with Citizens Assembly on climate, you need to make sure first of all that the citizens that are present, that there are all different sort of strands of opinion. So some people that don't think climate is a big issue, some people think that it's nonsense, some people haven't really thought about it, some people who are really, really passionate, and that those range of opinions need to be representative of the public. Otherwise, it could be conceived of as just some sort of hippie thing and everyone agreeing together. So it's really important. And I think others will know better than I do about this, but I think in the CAUK, for example, there was someone who I think was a fitter of gas boilers. And actually, by the end of the process, he wanted to get rid of his own job. So it's really important to understand these processes and to see, and yes, that there should be a range of speakers within the Citizens Assembly. We're calling for here. There are certain sort of topics that we've said need to be covered. One is intergenerational fairness, one is international fairness, and another is, of course, thinking about the just transition. Mm-hmm. So we're saying that jobs are really important, people's security is really important, not ignoring that fact.
Yeah, and I think what's amazing about Citizen Assembly is it asks citizens to also take on a different hat as well. Like in other parts of your life, you'll have experience and expertise, and you'll come as a certain person with all of these expertise, but also we're asking you to show up as a public citizen and to make good decisions collectively. And I think that's what's fascinating. We're not asking them to leave all their identities at the door, like bring them in, bring all of your understanding of the world in there. But also we're asking you, a bit like on a jury system, to take this sort of public facing role. And I think that's incredibly empowering for people. It certainly has been the Citizen Assemblies I've been involved with.
Definitely.
Okay, so now it's time for some good old-fashioned participation ourselves. And this is the point where obviously in real life, we would be nicely into groups. I'd be asking you to rearrange the furniture, but unfortunately we are going to have this all much more efficiently done, which I think is a less nice way of doing it, by Zoom. So many of you will have indicated the breakout groups that you're interested in joining, and so we'll have that already on file. So Grace is going to help me kind of pre-assign people to the breakout groups, and off you go. Just a couple of notes on this. We'll be in these breakout groups quite short, for about 20 minutes. Please keep normal Zoom etiquette, keep yourself on mute if you're not speaking. If you'd like to make a comment or chip in at any point, you can put an H in the chat, you can wave at your facilitator. So the three groups will be facilitated by the three different speakers, Stuart, Sarah and Amy. I'll be sitting in the main room with Grace, so if any problems happen, you have any tech problems, or you're in the wrong breakout room, you can stay in the main session here. So when you get a little invite, ask you to join a breakout room, you can reject that and just stay in the main session, or you can come back here if the breakout session is not the one that you asked for. Secondly, there is a Google document where people can make notes and have additional conversation and put a record of your conversation in there. And we're asking you 3 quick questions in this Google document. So Grace will put a link in the chat here too, and I'm also going to go and get that link. And the 3 questions we're asking, and we're asking them across all of the different sessions we're running for the Build Back Better How, is firstly, what about this project or campaign illustrates for you the values of a good society, the values and principles that we want to uphold? What is good about it? Secondly, how does it work and why does it work? And maybe also some of the challenges to do with it. We've had a bit of interrogation from all of us here, from all of the speakers, about some of the obstacles that we might need to overcome with their proposed ideas. And thirdly, and maybe this is the most important one, how can this idea that we've heard today be developed? Now, it might be shared, it might be spread, it might be scaled, it might be advanced in some way. And at the very end, we're going to hear 30-second pitches from the 3 speakers about how you can get involved. But those are the 3 questions to look at. You can also ask any questions of the speakers if you wanted more follow-up or more details on anything that they said. Yeah, so thanks everybody for sticking with us and participating in the great breakout groups. As I was just saying, you know, as I was floating around, I was hearing so much rich and lively conversation happening there, which is exactly how we hope the breakout groups work. So thanks for sticking with the tech weirdness of the breakout groups. So we just have a couple of minutes left, and I wanted to give the speakers a final chance to just say something about what you can do, given that you might have been inspired or galvanized or energized by what you've heard from the speakers today. So in reverse order, I'm going to ask the speakers to just give a kind of 30-second countdown pitch, and I will start singing the countdown tune if you go over that. So please give your 30-second pitch of what you would like people to do to advance or develop the idea, or what action they can take if they want to know more or see more of what you've been discussing. So over to you, Amy.
Brilliant. I'm just going to try and really quickly do a plug and share the screen here. It'd be really great if any of you could join us on the 9th of November at 6 o'clock. We've got Baroness Boycott, Caroline Lucas, Professor Tim Jackson, Kumi Naidoo and Kate Rayworth of Donut Economics talking around issues contained within the bill. There'll be information up on our website, ceebill.uk, and we'll be tweeting about it at ceebill now. So do find out more. It's not on there yet, but it will be at the beginning of the week latest. Or do contact me at info@ceebill.uk. And thank you for all your questions.
Brilliant. That was a show. That was a pro. It shows you how you can do it. Quick and snappy. Everyone do that. Sarah, over to you.
So how you can get involved depends slightly what you're working on. If you happen to be working for a local council, or you're a practitioner that delivers these kinds of methods, we run free networks for both those groups where you can share learning, discuss kind of key issues together. So please get in touch with me and I can send you the details about the networks. I don't run either of them personally, so I can say that they're great. If you're working on other policy issues, a plea to please mainstream thinking about how the role of public engagement and how democracy is working in your issues rather than always leaving it as a separate thing to one side, because it's fundamental. And just to say that on the Involve website, we have something called Knowledge Base, which has loads about practically how you do this and also some of the theory. We have a handbook for people wanting to build back locally and for those wanting to run citizens' assemblies locally. And if you want to keep in touch with what we're doing, please sign up to our newsletter, which is also on our website.
Woo! Take a breath. That was like just a minute just there. No repetition involved though, and certainly no deviation. You should definitely check that our handbook out. It's really brilliant. I really recommend it. And for those of you interested in how to do that, involved with like a ton of resources, it's really worth going to the website and checking out. This bit of a goldmine there for facilitative and deliberative practice. So Stuart, over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, I guess just two things. One would be, maybe the next time you're involved in a discussion about political reform, whether it's devolution, reform of the second chamber, PR, maybe it's worth reflecting and talking about whether it's useful, helpful, important to go through this loop of a citizens' assembly. And then secondly, I recommend, there's a book that I had on my slide in the references that I think is really important, a kind of very useful book that's on this topic, which is Helene Landemore's new book, Open Democracy. So I strongly recommend that.
That's brilliant. And we're doing our best to get Ellen on the podcast as well. So hopefully, fingers crossed that we will have her on at some point soon. So brilliant. I promised you I finished on time, and I'm still on track to do that. Firstly, huge thanks to our speakers, Stuart, Sarah and Amy, for giving their time up today and for being so energizing and lively. And they were fantastic presentations, I think you'll agree. It was also great to see so many of you here, and clearly such great appetite. Someone saying in the chat they wanted another hour and a half. I'd be very happy to do that. And I think we've seen clearly that this has a lot of people want to discuss this in much more detail because there's so many different layers to this and how we want to advance this agenda. So rest assured, this is a deep part of what we do here at Compass. It's kind of the golden thread of our work is democracy. So we'll be thinking about other sessions to put on. If you enjoyed this session, please do check out tomorrow's session. I'm really excited for it as well. It's our final session of the Build That Better How series, and it'll be on leadership. So as we've seen today, there have been a lot of ructions, let's say, in the political parties around leadership at the moment, and we'll be discussing what good leadership looks like, how we might be pushing it, and how we can advance the cause of good leadership through different parts of society, not just in politics. And we have a great podcast coming up next week, which is on Thursday night. We're hoping to run that as an open session for everyone as well. So that will be on the US election. And we've got 3 amazing American speakers coming on to talk about. They've all been working on projects to cut across divides in the States. So it's very relevant to this. How do you do democracy differently, especially against the backdrop of a lot of division and polarization in the States? Or is it? This is what we'll be interrogating as well. Final couple of things. If you enjoyed the session, please do throw a few coins in the bucket on the way out. You can click the link that Grace is going to put in the chat. And to see and hear more and participate more in us as an organisation, please do sign up as a Compass member. We'd love to have you involved. And as a lot of people were saying in the groups, we just need to see this happening across the country. Compass have got a network of local groups in different parts of the UK. So if you sign up as a member, we can connect you with Compass members locally who are pushing a lot of the democratic agenda where they are. Thanks again for coming. Please enjoy the rest of your Friday. Enjoy your very spooky Halloween weekend, and hope to see you on tomorrow's call at 2 p.m. Thanks, everyone. That's a wrap.